end the occupation. BDS.
If the fake Stinians want a Palestine, then it already exists, aka Jordan.
Who you calling fake? Your people are whiter than ghosts. No one buys your stupid fairy tale about you genocidal Zio-Nazi invaders being indigenous to the Middle East. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free.
Hey, who you calling genocidal? The waging of genocide against Jews is written right into the goddamn charter of those Hamas thugs you terrorist savages duly elected.
Enough! Hi, my name is Sandra Goldstein, or Sandra LLAP on the internets. Well, Andy Warhol promised me 15 minutes, so I'm cashing in now. Although this video is actually around 40 minutes. So I can only hope that you'll like the first 15 enough to keep watching through the remaining 25. And if anyone feels that they can present a comprehensive analysis and viable solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in fewer minutes, then please, by all means, be my guest. So, at present, the solution is unknown. Thus, let's call it X. And so now, we solve for X. What could be the terms of a permanent truce? The doable sets of conditions imposed by each side on the other, such that if both sides complied with their respective obligations, there would be a mutual agreement to cease hostilities. I have long been advocating for Israel to extend a genuinely equitable peace offer to the Palestinians, one with concessions so generous that if it was nevertheless rejected, it would become incontrovertibly clear that it is Israel that truly seeks peace, but the Palestinians are just hopelessly unreasonable. And for any who may be wondering, no, I'm afraid it doesn't much matter anymore what allegedly stupendous deals Israel may have offered 10, 15, 25, etc. years ago, because whatever karma points Israel may have gained from those past overtures, however gracious, have long since been squandered on relentless settlement development that sliced the West Bank to ribbons. And how drastically this loss of karma has been underestimated is tragic. Building houses may not seem anywhere near as odious as terrorist violence, but it has nevertheless been every bit as potent an obstacle to peace. Oh, and in the comment pinned at the top are links corresponding to all the numbers on these slides. So if Israel were today to freeze settlement development and put a maximally generous offer on the table, and if this was turned down, then this would elevate Israel's image and incriminate the Palestinians more than anything else that Israel could possibly do. And consequently, would cripple BDS more than anything else ever could. For there's only two possibilities. Either the deal is accepted or it's rejected. If it's accepted, well then, game over, because the establishment of a fair peace pretty much renders BDS moot and is like the main goal here. And if the deal is rejected, then BDS would suffer a huge loss of public sympathy, which boycotts cannot succeed without. Thus, this seems the most sensible course for Israel to take. In contrast, there's been attempts here in the US, in these hyperbolically interesting times, to criminalize support for BDS, which is arguably one of the worst responses to BDS, as such laws are blatantly unconstitutional. People have a right to protest and boycott whoever or whatever the hell they like. Although then, by the same token, I as well possess this same right to free expression, a right I shall exercise right now in pointing out what I feel are the movement's critical flaws. Frederick Douglass famously said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand," and Israel unquestionably is the more powerful entity in this equation. So, I get it. I do understand that there are situations for which economic tactics are necessary and appropriate, and such methods can indeed be effective towards bringing about desired reforms. So the issue here isn't the methods, it's the goals. It cannot be demanded of Israel something which would effectively destroy Israel if Israel were to concede to it. You could boycott Israel or any other country until the heat death of the universe, to no avail, because, as should be exceedingly obvious, Israel or any other country is never going to just acquiesce to committing national suicide. But now, imagine the following. We, the newly enlightened boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, do hereby officially proclaim that if Israel were to offer the following peace deal, we would then fully support the resumption of normalized economic relations with Israel and formally end our campaign against Israel. Or, here's another framing, a petition to the United Nations. Present before the UN representatives of Israel and the PA the following solution, to be voted upon by the citizens of Israel and the Palestinian residents of the West Bank and Gaza. If it is rejected by the majority of either side, then whichever sides reject it are obliged to produce a counterproposal to be voted upon by the public of the other side, with the same expectation being upon the other side to offer a counterproposal if they reject the counterproposal, etc. And if the repetition of this procedure ultimately yields a proposal that the majority of both peoples accept, then the UN will provide ample financial assistance to both sides for use towards the implementation of this solution. 4,586,000 have signed. Let's get to 5 million. Sure, why not? Billions of people watched a silly Korean pop music video not that long ago. And, in fact, perhaps you might recall my spate of frantic articles when this Bedouin village was under imminent threat of demolition. Or maybe you don't. That's okay. The upshot is that this humble village, with its famed tire school, so named because it was literally constructed from tires due to restrictions on building materials imposed by Israel and the West Bank, still stands intact today because a massive international outcry was mobilized in opposition to its destruction, with this petition accumulating over 790,000 signatures. That's a weird way to spell tire. Anyway, it thus seems perfectly within the realm of the possible that just the right formulation of such a petition could generate millions of signatures. Oh, all you clever, clever people out there. Is there not one soul among you billions who can crack this nut?
Sandra, we have no idea.
Well, that's okay, because I do. This solution is comprised of 6 tenets. Some are flexible, but there's some that aren't. I'll start with what must be, and those would be the first 2. 1, mutual recognition by the respective leaderships of the Israelis and Palestinians of a commitment to cease violence, the existence of the other state, and the right of the other state to exist. 2, the sovereign state of Palestine is officially established, comprised of Gaza and the West Bank based on the 1967 border. Or basically, that there must be both a state of Israel and a state of Palestine. And why this must be is that there's an argument in defense of this, which is pretty much unassailable because it isn't really political, it's fundamentally mathematical. But first, a few statistics. In 2018, there were 1,652 anti-Semitic incidents in the UK, a 16% increase relative to 2017. 1,799 anti-Semitic crimes in Germany, an increase of nearly 20% relative to 2017. 541 anti-Semitic acts in France, 74% more than in 2017. And from a poll conducted by the EU over 12 EU member states about a year ago, nearly 90% of European Jews feel that anti-Semitism has increased in their home countries over the past 5 years, and almost 30% say they have been harassed at least once in the past year. Of the more than 16,000 Jews who participated in the online survey, 85% rated anti-Semitism the biggest social or political problem in the country where they live. 38% said they had considered emigrating because they did not feel safe as Jews. And just this past May, the president of the European Jewish Congress stated, "Anti-Semitism has progressed to the point of calling into question the very continuation of Jewish life in Europe." So, what can Jews do about this? Be less hateable, maybe? Oh, especially big bad Israel, right? Well, actually, that Israel is blamed for anti-Semitism is but a testament to how the bias is so ingrained it's beyond perception. Could someone who says, "Goddamn Israel, they violated subsection 4b of Article 22 of international law, thus proving that Hitler was right and we should finish the job," really be all that sincerely motivated by human rights concerns? I'm not making this up. I can't make this up. Here is an actual quote from a man who was convicted of vandalizing a synagogue. Commenting on a purported video of IDF soldiers harassing Palestinian women and children, Zahalilov, writing under his screen name Ali Ahiska, wrote, "This video makes me want to kill every single Jew out there, finish what Hitler couldn't." Chronic haters just fish for ways to rationalize their bigotry. Because for haters, the hate comes first and the reasons come second. So even if Israel were to be so perfect that Amnesty International was inspired to create a brand new award specifically to honor Israel with, best human rights record in the whole wide world by far, people would still have raging hatred of Jews, because if there should be no reason, then they just make crap up out of whole cloth, like when millions of Jewish men, women, and children were ruthlessly slaughtered before the state of Israel even existed. And I bet a lot of you are sitting there still completely unconvinced, thinking, "Oh no, anti-Semitism is because of Israel. Yeah, Israel." Because nothing, of course, no matter how heinous, that's said or done by someone who isn't Jewish could ever actually be their own fault. Heaven forfend. No. Everything must ultimately be the fault of some Jew somewhere, right? Okay, fine. Go ahead and keep believing that. I've honestly long since given up. For what can Jews possibly say to people like this to persuade them that Jews have a right to exist when, if they don't think that Jews even have a right to exist, then anything said or done by Jews will just be automatically dismissed by them, as Jews clearly can't be impartial with respect to the question of whether or not they should all be killed. And if I may be so bold as to ask, why should it be incumbent upon Jews to justify to the rest of the world their very right to exist? It comes down to assessing what can be done and what can't. Jews are utterly powerless against this pathological hatred against them, but it is possible for there to be a state where Jews can always find refuge in. Well, obviously it's possible, as evidenced by the fact that this state does indeed now exist. And there's an analogous and equally compelling reason for the state of Palestine to exist, but before I get to that, if I may be permitted a slight digression. I do not in any way mean to imply here that it's wrong to criticize Israel, or that criticizing Israel is somehow inherently anti-Semitic. Of course, it's possible to criticize Israel without being anti-Semitic. You think you got more woke cred on me, I published an article over 2 years ago advocating for the U.S. to cut funding to Israel. Yeah? So, what makes some things anti-Semitic and other things not anti-Semitic? Well, in my case, my recommendation to cut Israel's aid was instigated by Israel constructing a new settlement in the West Bank. Hence, my criticism of Israel was really pro-Israel, yes, because this activity runs directly counter to Israel's long-term best interests, being as it's flagrantly hindering peace, as I've already mentioned, but it's well worth repeating. So, on the one hand, we have criticism of Israel, which is actually for the benefit of Israel and everyone else involved in this conflict as well, of course, versus a transparent pretext to incite genocide against Jews. Look, I'm sorry if I may be coming across as arrogant or abrasive. I am by no means suggesting that this conflict is a simple one. It's just that there's certain fairly key aspects of this which are being made out to be a lot more difficult than they really are. The problem undeniably is hard, but it's not so hard as to be absolutely impossible. A bit of added difficulty only means that a bit of added effort is needed to overcome the added challenge. So, moving along, the need for a Palestinian state. Again, let's start with some statistics. Courtesy of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East. Nearly 1/3 of the registered Palestine refugees, more than 1.5 million individuals, live in 58 recognized Palestine refugee camps in Jordan, Lebanon, the Syrian Arab Republic, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Socioeconomic conditions in the camps are generally poor, with high population density, cramped living conditions, and inadequate basic infrastructure such as roads and sewers. So, you may wonder why these Palestinians were never properly integrated into the countries that they had fled to, these many decades ago, and instead were left to languish in these squalid camps for generations. Well, for that matter, you could also wonder why some people are so intent on being monstrously hateful towards Jews. But once again, it comes down to playing the hand you're dealt, so to speak, and recognizing what's within our control and what's not. So the problem can be defined as that which is beyond our control and is impacting us adversely. And so then the solution would be that which is within our capability to do that can counteract the detrimental effects of the problem. So, for the problem of perennial anti-Semitism, the solution is thus the State of Israel, to serve eternally as a Jewish haven. And given the problem that there's evidently no country on earth willing to fully absorb the present population of stateless Palestinians, the solution is to create a new state, i.e. Palestine, to serve as the nation that these people can be citizens of. And you might say, well, how about if Israel allowed the entire world's population of 7 million diaspora Palestinians to resettle within Israel? And I would say, how about no? How about we not demand of one of the smallest countries on the planet and already one of the most densely populated that it about double its population? As already noted, imposing conditions that cannot possibly be fulfilled will never amount to anything more than an exercise in futility. Although, you could also ask, accepting that there must be both A, a state that can serve as a Jewish haven, and B, a state that can serve as a Palestinian homeland, why A and B couldn't be one and the same, i.e., why couldn't a single combined state serve as a homeland for both Jews and Palestinians? And here is where the math comes in. The reason there must be two distinct states is that if the combined state should end up with a non-Jewish majority, then this non-Jewish majority could potentially vote to overturn what is now Israel's law of return for Jews. And likewise, a combined state that might end up with a Jewish majority runs the risk of the Jewish majority voting to overturn the preference granted to Palestinians for immigration. Therefore, a Jewish majority state is required in order so that it can maintain the immigration laws necessary for it to function as a homeland for Jews, and likewise, a state with a Palestinian majority is required in order so that it can maintain the immigration laws necessary for it to function as a homeland for Palestinians. There, irrefutable, yes? No? Well, that's okay, because I just so happen to have a second irrefutable argument as a backup in case one irrefutable argument was insufficient. And it's just basic logic. The way to peace is for Israel to make an offer that the Palestinians subsequently accept. And Israel is simply never going to offer anything that doesn't ensure its continued existence. And likewise, Palestine is never going to accept anything that precludes its own existence. Ergo ipso facto, the only solutions which are actually attainable are those which stipulate the existence of both Israel and Palestine. Okay, so now that we've definitively established that there must be two states, let's move on to what I'd prefer, which would be for this mandatory two-state paradigm to be arrived at with the minimal amount of human misery and suffering as possible. A solution is more than just the particular specifications for a final arrangement. That's only half of it. The other half of any solution are the set of actions required in order for the specified final arrangement to be actualized. So then, how to get to the point where there's two states? Well, one state already exists, namely Israel. Thus, it's just a matter of creating the state of Palestine, but, oh yeah, there's that. So, what do we do? Forcibly kick the settlers out of Palestine? All 800,000 of them, according to the current tally? Seems a rather unsavory and unenviable prospect to undertake. Thus, mightn't it be preferable for the settlers to be allowed to remain in Palestine? Although, I do recognize that this represents quite a considerable concession on the part of Palestine. So, in return, yes, remember this? So, how's about Israel open its borders to a comparable number of diaspora Palestinians? 800K is not so high that Israel would fatally collapse under the weight of the influx, but it's high enough that no one could seriously claim that it wouldn't be a monumental feat for Israel to accommodate this. Now, I will also acknowledge the holes that can be poked into the legitimacy of the Palestinians' claim to the right of return, i.e., that the Palestinians who'd fled during the Nakba were escaping the war of annihilation against the nascent state of Israel waged by the joint armies of the surrounding Arab nations, as much as they were escaping any deliberate Israeli offenses against Palestinians. And these refugees, at this point, are really mostly the children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, etc., of the original refugees from 1948, so it's a rather questionable interpretation of international law for the right of return to be applied to infinite generations of descendants. But again, hello! So even if the claim of the Palestinians to a right of return might not be 100% bulletproof, it can nevertheless still be honored, at least to some extent, as a purely magnanimous gesture for the sake of peace, such as what's being expected of the other party in allowing the settlers to remain in Palestine. Hence, tenets. 3. The 800,000 Jewish settlers residing within Palestine are granted an amnesty and are permitted to remain as full citizens of Palestine. 4. The implementation of a right of return and compensation policy for diaspora Palestinians, where up to 800,000 will be accepted into Israel as citizens of Israel, and any beyond that amount will be provided compensation to resettle elsewhere, including to the new state of Palestine, if they choose this. And lastly, what I'm neutral about. Note the asterisks. My initial postulation had been that the Jewish settlers remaining in Palestine would be citizens of Palestine, and the Palestinian returnees to Israel would be citizens of Israel. However, I was subsequently informed of another possibility, such as that both the Jewish settlers in Palestine and the Palestinian returnees to Israel could perhaps be permitted to hold dual Israeli-Palestinian citizenship. Or yet another possibility, that if they so choose, a Jewish settler in Palestine could have only Israeli citizenship, and a Palestinian returnee to Israel could have only Palestinian citizenship. So, which should it be? Well, honestly, I don't know. Can any one person possibly know all? But what I do know is that the more popular support a solution has behind it, the higher the chances are of it succeeding. And so, I leave this one up to the common will, meaning you. Please feel free to register your preference by participating in the poll at the end of the article at this link. And the next tenet, regarding Jerusalem. My initial postulation had been 5. The division of Jerusalem, with East Jerusalem going to Palestine and West Jerusalem going to Israel, and all Palestinians and Israelis shall be allowed full, unfettered access to their respective holy sites throughout the entire city. But I have since been informed of another possibility, that Jerusalem could instead remain whole and be administered by an international body, such as the UN, whereby both Israel and Palestine could claim the city as their capital. And once again, I really don't have the faintest clue as to which might be better. But if you have a certain preference for one over the other, then you can let this be known via the poll at the end of this other article. Oh, and I should also mention that there's no need at all to read either of these articles. You can just skip straight to the polls at the end of them, because I reiterate in this video all of the main points from both of those articles. Well, at the present time, the data from these polls is too sparse to be able to draw any definite conclusions from them. But I swear before Great Jah and all of humanity that if these polls should gather enough responses so that clear preferences are indicated, then the tenets will change accordingly if need be. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but I'd said that there were 6. Well, the last one deserves some time all to itself. 6. The formation of an overarching federation/alliance that both Israel and Palestine are to be member states of. Before I go any further, though, I've now been talking for around a half hour, and I know this all is a lot to process, so a quick recap. We have this patch of land, and there needs to be 2 states on it, so some boundary must be drawn, demarcating the states. However, there will then be some Israelis who will wind up behind the Palestinian border once the border's been set. So Palestine will allow these settlers to remain in Palestine in exchange for Israel allowing the return to Israel of a comparable number of diaspora Palestinians. But after this initial one-time acceptance of the present settlers by Palestine and the designated number of Palestinian returnees by Israel, as stipulated by the peace agreement, from then onwards, Israel will retain full control over immigration into Israel and thus can maintain its current policy that favors Jews, and likewise, Palestine will have every bit as much power to accept or reject whichever prospective immigrants they'd like to. And although I've already made this point, it's important enough to emphasize some more, because I've seen these kinds of immigration policies disparaged as discriminatory or even, gasp, racist. But this characterization inverts the roles of the haters and hatees here. A haven is a defensive measure driven by racism against those in need of it, and not by the alleged racism of those in need of it. Also, there's a sort of yin-yang symmetry with this solution, with one state having a Jewish majority and an Arab minority existing side by side with a state that has an Arab majority and a Jewish minority. And all that should be expected of these states is that they each treat all of its own citizens exactly equally, regardless of the religion or ethnicity or whatever else of the citizens. But a state has no obligations whatsoever towards people outside of the state. Hence why it's perfectly fine for immigration policies to be discriminatory, for these policies only apply to and affect people currently outside of the state. All right, so we've got 2 states with a border between them that is closed in terms of permanent residency and citizenship. But what about for employment? If Ahmed lives in Ramallah but has a job in a factory in Tel Aviv, so he goes to Tel Aviv every day and then back to his home in Ramallah every night, I'm not seeing any problems with that. And if Miriam lives in Beersheba but would love to spend the day frolicking on the sunny beaches of Gaza and then go back to her home in Beersheba, that's fine too. And Dima in Nablus can attend her cousin's wedding in Nazareth, and Yuval in Haifa can visit the sacred tomb of the patriarchs in Hebron. Essentially, the border can be entirely open for everything, with the one sole exception being for permanent residency and citizenship, as is necessary in order to preserve the existence of both states. And what about mass transit? Perhaps a single system of buses and trains could be shared by Israel and Palestine? And utilities, water, electricity grids? Currency? Defense? There could in fact be many commonalities for the sake of efficiency and convenience. And that's where the Confederation comes in. The governing body, somewhat analogous to the European Union, composed of representatives from both Israel and Palestine, whose function would be to administer these commonalities. Again, the one firm requirement is simply that both states must exist. So, if both states exist, and additionally a third unifying entity also exists as well, then this technically still does satisfy the requirement that both states exist. But I can't take the credit for coming up with this concept, though. As Yossi Beilin, a former Justice Minister of Israel, wrote in an article published a few months ago titled, "The Two-State Solution Can Be Achieved Through a Confederation," the idea isn't new. Actually, the Partition Resolution UN General Assembly 181 has been suggesting an economic confederation for 10 years, and when one takes into account the very small area to the west of the Jordan River, it seems very artificial for two totally separate entities to plan their infrastructure separately and to deal separately with joint challenges like agricultural diseases, among many others. Cooperation and coordination is indispensable. And a more detailed vision of this sort of Confederate model is laid out by Yoel Oz in his fine book, Abrahamic Confederation, A Solution to the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, where he says of this solution that it is so obvious that it has been hiding in plain sight.
But Sandra, we don't care at all about any of this.
Well, I have just one word for you. Yeah, I'm gonna go there. Again, some statistics. From the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, 38% of Gazans live in poverty. 26% of the Gazan workforce, including 38% of youths, is unemployed. 54% of Gazans are food insecure, and over 75% are aid recipients. 35% of Gaza's farmland and 85% of its fishing waters are totally or partially inaccessible due to Israeli military measures. Over 90% of the water from the Gaza aquifer is undrinkable. About 1/3 of the items in the essential drug list are out of stock. And the top 10 recipients of U.S. foreign aid. Oh, look at that. Israel is number 1 by a lot. And financial ties inescapably bind us morally as well. Thus, the suffering of the Gazans lies on our collective conscience. Trust me, I get no pleasure whatsoever from saying this, but I feel I must say it. And you're like, what is this Mishugas, Sandra? How is Gaza Israel's fault, let alone our fault? The blockade of Gaza is because of Hamas! Those fanatics hell-bent on diverting every resource they can get their bloody hands on to attacking Israel. Well, from Oxfam International, Israel has security concerns, including indiscriminate rocket fire from Gaza by armed groups. But even if it were deemed necessary to restrict materials on the basis of these concerns, Israel is prohibited under international law from disregarding the humanitarian requirements of Palestinians when doing so. Security concerns cannot be used as a justification for violating the rights of civilians living under occupation. Whoa, how can security concerns not matter? If one of Hamas's blasted rockets hits a school playground in Israel and wipes out a kindergarten class, do those innocent lives not matter? It doesn't matter. But it does matter. It doesn't matter. It does matter. It doesn't matter. It does matter. And here we're caught in an infinite loop. The only way to break out of that I could see is to finally, once and for all, establish peace. Hand in hand is a network of bilingual integrated schools throughout Israel that have allowed thousands of Jewish and Arab children to learn together. EcoPeace is an organization bringing together Jordanian, Palestinian, and Israeli environmentalists to jointly study and tackle the shared environmental concerns of this region. These sorts of ventures are thoroughly wonderful and deserve our wholehearted, unequivocal support, as they are steps in the right direction, helping to bring us closer to peace. But to actually arrive at the point of having peace, the conflict must be ultimately resolved by implementing a solution. There's just no getting around this. Don't much care for my solution? Well, that's okay too, because there are others, such as the peace proposal of Professor Mohammed Dajani Dowdy. Who, you might ask, is Professor Mohammed Dajani Dowdy? Well, he is arguably one of the coolest men on this entire planet. You may be cool, but you're not. Take your Palestinian students on a trip to Auschwitz only to be rewarded with getting your car torched cool. And guess what? His proposal is beautiful. There's an outline of it at this link, which fulfills the Zionist dream of Jewish self-determination in Eretz Yisrael while diffusing the legitimate grievances that fuel Palestinian hatred of Zionism. So, this could be X. And here's another excellent Arab writer, Fred Maroon. Just follow this link for a remarkably detailed blueprint for how the occupation of the West Bank could be ended without this turning out as Gaza 2.0. Yoel Oz, Professor Dejani Dowdy, Fred Maroon, and yours truly, proffer peace mentality. This is stalemate mentality. The number one reason for why there isn't peace today is a preponderance of stalemate mentality and a paucity of peace mentality. Yes, that's it. Oh, Israelis and their sympathizers will say, we, who are the epitome of moral perfection, unwavering in our devotion to all that is good and true, would love nothing more than for there to be a just resolution to the conflict, but those damned Arabs will never abandon their violent quest to destroy Israel. And Palestinians and their sympathizers will say, we, whose hearts are as wide as the ocean and overflowing with nothing but the purest of love for our ancestral cousins, want only to live together in peaceful harmony with them. But those greedy Zionist bastards want all the land to themselves. And everyone says, we want peace. Wouldn't it be nice if we had peace? But, who can we blame now? Yes, the leaders. There isn't peace because the present leaders aren't motivated to seek peace, and so naturally it never comes about. Well, sorry, but that excuse only goes so far, considering that leaders, particularly in the case of Israel in more recent years, are chosen by the people. And then when we run out of people to blame, we can always turn to blaming God. Yes, the supreme being, creator of life and the whole freaking universe. Well, apparently this wasn't enough for us, as we also entreat upon the Almighty to send unto us some magical emissary to deliver peace, because we're too intellectually lazy and pathetic to do this for ourselves. Or are we? Doesn't it all come down to what we choose? There's a question I've been asking for years that I have yet to get a satisfactory answer to, which is, if peace is essentially us deciding to have peace by agreeing on some solution, then how can peace be divinely bestowed upon us without us losing our free will? So no, I don't believe that God will do this for us, because it's perfectly within our own collective capabilities to just settle upon something. Some first don't get a solution that ensures the continued existence of both Israel and Palestine. There is simply no excuse for this not to happen when such solutions exist. But instead, what we basically have now is one side predominantly saying, we want Y, and the other side predominantly saying, we want Z, where Y is substantially different than Z. Whereas, what would be vastly more productive would be for there to be a plurality of both sides saying, we want X, where X is neither Y nor Z, but rather was some sensible compromise between the two. Yes, compromise, because it is either that, which leads to peace, or the refusal to compromise, which leads to eternal stalemate, such as what there's been. There are no other possibilities. Any outcomes other than compromise or stalemate are just illusory, a chimera. They're never going to happen. Now, compromise does mean, unavoidably, that neither side gets to have everything exactly as they might like. But both sides will get enough to not only survive, but thrive. For the benefits of peace far outweigh whatever concessions were necessary to attain the peace, hence how peace and prosperity go together. And with this, I will end. Long live Israel. Long live Palestine. Live long and prosper. And
Shalom.
Salam.
peace.